This illustration deals with ground fault protection of equipment, GFPE, in accordance with 215.10, Exception 3. Purpose of change. A new exception has been added to permit the use of temporary feeders during repair, maintenance, or emergencies. Might present to the designer difficulties in achieving the required ground fault protection. This revision adds a new exception to permit temporary feeders to be used during the period of time necessary for repair, maintenance, or emergencies without having to install ground fault protection in accordance with 215.10. However, this time period permitted is not to exceed 90 days. So let's review at the service equipment location in the illustration, and we're talking about the days permitted, and that's where the 90-day rule appears, is 590.3b. However, if my memory does not fail me, 590.3a requires the service equipment to be wired in a permanent type requirement, while the feeder routed over to the sub-panel, I call it there, can be temporarily. And for 90 days, we would not have to install ground fault protection for 480, 277 volt systems with devices rated 1,000 amps or greater. Now notice, if you look in the also rule right above the sub panel that I just kind of identified that panel as, notice also see 230.95, and I would also look at 215.10, 210.15 and 210.13, and you would pick up service requirements, feeder requirements, branch circuit requirements for systems of 480, 277 volt, 3-phase, 4-wire, where the devices are 1,000 amps or greater. And then if you would notice the arrow that points to the service equipment at the very top, it talks about panel boards, switchboards that are located in industrial facilities, 408.4b. And then notice the circuit mapping requirement to the right. You know, on the service area, you see the circuit mapping, you see circuit mapping on the sub-panel. But notice it's 408.4 that requires the feeder circuits and the branch circuits to be identified as to exactly what that particular circuit breaker supplies. And then at the panel board, at the service, you would also have identified the circuit that feeds the sub-panel, and the sub-panel would have on its directory that it's receiving its source from the main service panel that you see there. Now, let's together review the notes. In Note 1, ground fault protection is not required for repair, maintenance, or emergency, for NEC 215.10, Exception 3. Note 2, for more than 6 feeder requirement rule, we would see the text in 225.30b in the NEC. However, for 15 and 20 amp GFCI rule, you'd see 215.9. Now, basically what that states, if my memory serves me correctly, if you had ground fault protection on the feeder, you would not need it on the branch circuits in that sub-panel. If you had ground fault protection on the service equipment, then you wouldn't need it further downstream. But notice that any system of 277, 480, and the devices are 1,000 amps or greater, then you would need ground fault protection for permanently installations. But however, in the Note 1, if you're in those conditions that we just called out there, then ground fault protection for that feeder and so forth would not be required for 90 days. Now, make note of one thing. There are 2 articles that deal with feeders. Article 215 deals with feeders inside the building. If you run a feeder outside the building, and this is very important, you go to Article 225, and on downstream in this little presentation, we will explain why that is very important to designers, installers, maintainers, as well as for inspectors making an inspection.